And if time is permitting and there's much interest, I might cover the second game here by the end of the year. You see that? That's me lying. I had every intent on doing this video, I just didn't want to make the commitment and let you guys down. So with that, let's just get into this. Parasite Eve II released on December 16th of 1999 in Japan. Roughly 9 months later, it released in Europe and North America. Developed and published by Squaresoft, this is the second entry in the series of the same name. Although it received mostly positive reviews at launch, negative reviews weren't exactly uncommon, and to this day, this remains a very divisive game. Some people claim this to be their favorite in the series, and at times, their favorite in the PS1 library. This sentiment is far more common for European audiences, however, this opinion doesn't have as much value as it seems, because Parasite Eve I never released in PAL territories. If you've seen the video I done for Parasite Eve I, you know that the game was incredibly unique in almost every regard. It tried something new and it was commended for it very highly. For better or worse, Parasite Eve II abandoned the gameplay mechanics that made PE1 unique almost entirely, and opted for something more along the lines of Silent Hill or Resident Evil 1 and 2. Whether this was a good direction to take the series in is up to the individual to decide, but it would serve us best to not make comparisons to Parasite Eve I's gameplay and to just judge this on its own merits. The game starts and we reprise our role as Aya Brea. Aya is no longer the New York cop she was in the previous game, as this one is set after the events of the first. Aya now belongs to an organization called MIST. MIST is the Mitochondrial Investigation and Suppression Team. Aya's job is to respond to and investigate the occurrences of NMCs. An NMC is a neo-mitochondrial creature. In short, these are creatures who have been transformed into violent and hideous monsters by an evolutionary process taking place in the mitochondria of their cells. Aya shares similarities to these creatures in the sense that her mitochondria have also undergone a change, but hers doesn't result in a transformation of her image. Instead, Aya has extra defenses against the power of NMCs and can access the untapped potential of the mitochondria that live in our cells. While it's not necessary to play the first game to understand this one, I would recommend it just to get the full backstory of where Aya's powers come from. But otherwise, you can jump into this one completely blind and experience it for what it is on its own. This is mostly made possible because the game uses an almost entirely new cast of characters, with characters from the previous game rarely getting little more than a passing reference to create loose ties between the two entries. The new cast of characters sadly lack any semblance of depth, but they serve as a decent enough tool to progress the plot. A plot that can be replayed several times over thanks to the multiple endings intrinsically tied to the different character routes. The game starts with an event at the Acropolis Tower. A SWAT team has already arrived and the situation looks grim, so MIST is called in to respond. Before we enter the tower, we are greeted by something so visually impressive it truly feels ahead of its time. While the pre-rendered backgrounds of the game are absolutely amazing in their own right, this is on a whole other level. It feels as though you are watching one of the game's FMVs, but control is still in your hands. The aspect ratio for this segment, much like with the FMVs, had to be dwarfed so the hardware could support it, but it is just incredible seeing that this level of visual fidelity could be supported during gameplay without relying on static backgrounds. After a brief talk with the squad on the ground level, Aya rides the elevator up to the top of Acropolis Tower and we're assaulted with the image of a gruesome massacre. This does great to strike a tone for the beginning of the game. The visuals and ambience here create an almost oppressive and eerie atmosphere. The next little bit sees us wandering around the tower for any trace of where these NMCs may have come from. What Aya finds is a human NMC, and a sky-scraping boss battle ensues. The boss battle is very much puzzle-oriented and serves as a great example of what's to come later. The boss escapes, and Aya, with her partner Rupert, is evacuated via helicopter as the building explodes. With the clues she gathered at the Acropolis Tower, the next step in her investigation takes her to Dryfield, a mostly abandoned desert town with possibly the worst layout a town could have. Really, Dryfield is just a glorified truck stop, but there's a lot going on here. Dryfield is small but complicated to get around, so it will feel much bigger than it actually is. The type of exploration that begins here will be how the rest of the game plays out. You will be going through each building, hall, and yard several times over, backtracking and solving puzzles and riddles as certain areas get blocked off and new areas open up. Much akin to how the first mansion works in Resident Evil, only not quite as sensibly designed. From here on out, the story is quite a bit slower to unfold. Aya continues to investigate the source of the NMCs and the ANMCs, the artificial neo-mitochondrial creatures, gathering clues and following them to their next logical location. The mystery deepens and develops beyond the ANMCs, uncovering a suspicious science facility and simultaneously raising questions about Aya's past. The story themes in most regards are horror-based, as this is through and through a survival horror game. But some of it feels so hokey and off the wall, it's hard to take it seriously. Parasite Eve I definitely had a story that took itself too seriously as well, but it was easier to be engaged with it because that game didn't have unprompted boss battles against mutated elephants with guns for mouths. As cool as this design is visually, I just couldn't help but wonder who made it and why. Like attaching airplane wings to a giraffe, it's laughable at best, and the answers don't exactly offer a good enough excuse. For as serious as the game tries to be with its atmosphere and mechanics, it'd serve it well to not have bosses with such exaggerated and comical designs. Perhaps just as bad were the golems later in the game, whose goofy appearance gives off a vibe similar to the augurs in Night Trap.
Very well.
Some enemies were legitimately creepy, however, if only because of these faces. With all this in mind, Parasite Eve II's story and presentation began to feel a lot more like a B-grade horror to me. Like Army of Darkness, mixed heavily with the themes of Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil, and a casual dash of visual inspiration from The Matrix. It's not necessarily a bad thing, as I do really enjoy B-grade horror, but it's simply too obvious how serious it's actually supposed to be, and so the tone consistently conflicts with the imagery and themes. Design hilarity aside, the boss battle against the gun-mouthed zombie elephant was pretty rad, and highlights the game's unique attention to detail as the boss destroys the environment in real time as you fight him. If there's one thing Parasite Eve II gets right unquestionably, it's the visuals. Characters all have clear and expressive faces. The environments with their pre-rendered backgrounds look incredible, and the way firing your gun changes the lighting on your character shows how much attention to detail actually went into the game, especially for the year it came out. The FMV sequences as well, while not usually thematically grand, are a major improvement over the first in terms of fidelity and realism. While I loved the FMVs in the first game, people thought I was too hard on them because I pointed out just how dated they became. People stated that FMVs like that are to be expected and don't need to be pointed out. For the most part, I agree they are to be expected, but this game is proof of just how much better they could do on the same hardware around roughly the same time. Parasite Eve II released not even 2 years after the first, and the difference in the FMVs feels generations apart. In many ways, I feel the FMVs here could be on the PS2 and nobody would question it. The one and only visual complaint I have is in the dialogue boxes. Simply put, they're ugly as sin. Thankfully, they are the only part of this game's interface I feel this way about. So we talked a lot about the visuals, the setup, and how the adventure actually unfolds, but I haven't hit on the combat and controls yet. I mentioned earlier the game works a lot more like Resident Evil or Silent Hill, but I didn't really tell you what any of that actually meant, so let's jump straight into that. New to this game are tank controls. These are not optional, so don't try to turn them off. I've long been a defender of tank controls, and especially in games with fixed camera angles like this. Battles all happen in real time, and the enemies exist in the stage before you engage, so random battles are done away with entirely. There are no timers or turn orders to control when or how you proceed during battle. When you aggro an enemy, the battle music simply ramps up and the dance routine begins. One nice feature here is that the game has 3 different battle tracks, and you choose for yourself which track to play in the options menu. If you are getting tired of one, you can switch it up at your convenience. The music in the game doesn't quite hit the heights of the first, but it's definitely all fine enough. Pushing square on the controller will target your enemy. While targeted, Aya will automatically orient herself to aim at the enemy. While aiming, simply press R1 or R2 to shoot, depending on your gun's firing capabilities. Bullets in the game are limited, but basic bullet types can be refilled to max at ammunition cases found throughout the stages. It is possible to run out, but the event is rare. Guns do not have the upgrade system they used to. Instead, this time you can equip accessories to them for stat boosts and additional features such as melee attack capabilities. This really helps control the balance of the game, as making a truly OP weapon early on is nearly impossible. The accessories for the guns can be found, but will most likely be purchased using BP, which is awarded at the end of each battle. BP will be your in-game currency and can be used to purchase curatives, ammo, and armor as well. The only armor in the game is bulletproof vests. Each vest has different stats and a different amount of item slots. The amount of item slots can be increased using items found during gameplay. The items you put in your vest slots are the only items you can bring into battle. Common items to put here are ammo, curatives, guns, and melee weapons. If you run out of ammo during battle and there's none left in your vest, well, sucks to be you. There is no way to change equipment once battle has begun. Some bosses can and will use every bullet you can bring into battle, and it can get very frustrating not having any way to change gear while in battle, but there's always a way to win if you try hard enough to find it. At the end of each battle, you are rewarded experience points. These don't go to leveling you up exactly, but they can be used to unlock and strengthen your special attacks that utilize this energy meter up here. When enemies attack you, your only real option aside from just taking the blow is evasion. So, this is where we run into what's arguably the biggest problem with the game, and it plagues the game from beginning to end. The combat is very action-heavy and will frequently have you fighting large amounts of enemies in environments that span several camera angles. The enemy placement in Parasite Eve II is absolutely atrocious, as many battles will begin with enemies you can't see from your camera angle and therefore cannot react to. Many enemies will telegraph an attack with a sound, but not all will, and when you have several enemies off camera, you have no way of knowing which of these dots on your GPS is coming after you. As such, your ability to evade an attack is a nearly useless ability to run blindly and hope for the best. This makes many battles boil down to shooting shit off camera that you don't know what it is, while hoping they don't find a way to rush you, and quite frankly, it just isn't fun. Without a pre-existing intimate knowledge of this game, this is going to be an extremely frustrating design flaw to play around. Not to make comparisons to Parasite Eve I, but to use it as an example, Parasite Eve I made me appreciate something that game, and many others, do right that I've always taken for granted. In Parasite Eve I, when a battle starts, the game takes over control of your character and camera, and brings you further into a zone. Once you're placed where the game wants you, the enemies spawn and battles happen on a single camera angle. This is done so you can see the whole battle as it's going on. This is useful, if not imperative, in real-time combat, especially if said combat is dealing with fixed camera angles and requires fast reflexes for proper evasion. Somewhere along the way, it seems Parasite Eve II missed the memo on that one, and this is without a doubt an egregious design flaw that just sucks the fun out of many battles and makes many more just feel like a frustrating and infuriating nuisance. Due to how the auto-aim works, if you are to competently evade, you'll need to jump between targeting on and off, otherwise Aya will always course correct to run straight at the enemy you are trying to avoid. This in and of itself wouldn't be too terrible if many of the battles weren't against hordes that just rush and surround you, leaving you no time to attack and evade, let alone balance whether or not you get to aim. It definitely makes the game harder, which addresses one of my biggest complaints about Parasite Eve I, but it does so at the cost of decent mechanics, competent enemy placement, and good design. While the tank controls complement the fixed camera angles and pre-rendered backgrounds, the enemy placement and battle mechanics are incongruous at best. The game takes about 8 hours to complete on the best route, and even longer if you struggle with some of the puzzles along the way. With deaths, this will take about 10 hours to complete, 3.5 hours on disc 1, maybe another 5 on disc 2. Parasite Eve II at its best is a gritty survival horror with next generation cinematics, decent music, great visuals, and oppressive and eerie atmospheres, complemented by an equally eerie soundtrack and some cool enemy design and set pieces. At its worst, it's a disjointed B-grade horror with a tonal identity crisis, infuriating and debilitating design flaws, a control scheme incongruent with the battle mechanics, enemy placements incongruent to the level design, and a narrative incongruent with the tone. As a whole package, Parasite Eve II is simply okay at best. I like the idea of this becoming a proper survival horror with its inventory space, tank controls, and very unforgiving save points in the latter half. And I think each mechanic in the game on its own is just great. I am a fan of this game's individual pieces, but when everything is together in one package, I feel like it just falls apart. I feel almost certain I'll think back on this game fondly a year from now, as many people do, simply because of its unique set pieces, events, and atmosphere, but playing the game again is not something I see myself doing. And if I ever tried, I know I would give up quickly, as I remember just how much of its individual components do not work well with each other. If you feel I'm being unfair or disingenuous, then I dare you to gamble your nostalgia and boot this game up and see how genuine my criticisms really are. Without a pre-existing intimate knowledge of this game to play around its flaws with, it's hard to get much more than an okay at best experience out of. It might be an unpopular opinion, but it's the only one I got. As a full package, Parasite Eve II is okay at best. Parasite Eve II may be better remembered rather than replayed or revisited. And that's all I'm going to say on Parasite Eve II, a game I wasn't too fond of looking back on. If you guys like the video, you know the deal. Like, comment, subscribe, share if you can. Links to socials are in the description. And as always, folks, thanks for watching. Well, hoping they don't find a way to rush you. And quite frankly, it just isn't fun. Kitty! What the fuck? Come here.